Hi everyone! So for this post-exam 2 lecture, we're going to be discussing, I want to start briefly with the limits to Jacksonian democracy, and then we're going to be talking about antebellum reforms. Um, for your final exam, it's going to start with this lecture, the antebellum reforms discussed in Chapter 10, and then I I only discuss one slide worth of Chapter 11, and then we'll get right into antebellum politics and the Civil War. So, let's get started. I want to start with talking a little bit about how democracy under President Jackson was limited. When we think about democracy, we think about equality among voting rights, people having voting rights, people having equal treatment under the law, that type of thing. But in America, we come to this gradually, right? And we all know this because we know, for example, that in the mid 20th century, we had the modern civil rights movement where Black Americans are fighting for their own equality under the law then. So let's start there. When you think about Jacksonian democracy, you really have pretty a pretty equal society for white males. Okay, so it's no longer this you have to be well educated, you have to be a landowner. Remember, we talked about how in colonial America and very early on, we had talked about land requirements for voting. It's no longer land ownership requirements for voting. It's no longer a thing. So you have pretty good equality for white men. So let's talk a little bit about those who are left out of this democracy. So first of all, blacks, and not only slaves, but free blacks as well. Jackson is going to attempt to deter abolitionists. So I don't mean here that blacks are attempting to deter abolitionists. Abolitionists are people who are trying to end slavery. We'll talk about abolition every time I see you for the rest of the semester, which isn't that many times. So abolitionists are trying to end slavery. Now Jackson would try to deter abolitionists, and I'll tell you how. You don't need to memorize this. You just need to know, which I think you probably all already do, that blacks were not equal under this democratic era of Jackson. So for example, what Jackson would do is in the North, abolitionists, we'll talk about this, they would, for example, write pamphlets about why slavery should be ended, the moral reasons, the political reasons, trying to get more people to join their cause. And what they would do is they would mail some of these pamphlets to the South. Well, Jackson was totally on board with having the pamphlets be destroyed, burned at the post offices, not even being sent out to their recipients, and that's a crime, right? It's against the law to tamper with mail. So Jackson, was fine with deterring abolitionists to the point of breaking the law. Jackson is going to be a president who is a little open, maybe I should say more than a little, open to the idea of not following certain laws when he doesn't feel it suits what he's trying to do. And the one of the most obvious examples of this happens with Indian removal. I'll give you a minute to write this. Okay, if you're still writing, that's okay. I'm going to explain this 5 civilized tribes thing, and you don't need to write any notes. I'll tell you what you want to know about Indian removal. So basically, early on in the United States, the idea was that Native Americans are not equal to whites because they are not as civilized, but there was this whole push to civilize them. And this is actually very common throughout most of the 19th century, not just for Americans against white Americans against Native Americans living in America, but also among other like white European powers that will colonize people in parts of Africa and Asia. they will take this idea with them. So basically, the idea is because they're not white, they're not, and their culture is not Christian, and their culture is different. Their religion, their language, their way of dress, they're going to be deemed uncivilized. So the idea is, well, it's our duty to civilize them. So we should just try to make them act more like us. And in the United States, some Native Americans are going to embrace this idea for the purpose of trying to be able to maintain living on their land. So the idea is they think that if they are to act white and do what the white Americans want them to do, then they won't have to give up their land. And the way they would do that is they would learn English, they would convert to Christianity, they would wear their hair, they would have their children wear their hair like white American kids, they would dress that way, they would send their children to school, that type of thing. So they were trying really hard to placate the white Americans so that they wouldn't be kicked off their land. So when I'm talking about the 5 civilized tribes, I'm talking about these 5 tribes that really attempted to assimilate into American culture so that they could remain where they were. These tribes are going to be living in parts of the states of North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama. That's the area where they live. The Cherokee Nation in particular is going to be split over this idea. So the members of the Cherokee Nation, a lot of them live in Georgia, the state of Georgia, are going to be split over whether or not they should try to act, quote, civilized, so that the whites will leave them alone, or if they should really fight for their ability to remain themselves. Their main hope is that they will be able to stay on their land. And so as a result, the Cherokee, a lot of them, as I mentioned above, are going to try to follow a white man's way of life, to try and placate the government. Okay, let me just sort of explain what's going on with the laws here. And then when we get through this slide, I'll tell you just what you need to know. The Indian Removal Act was this attempt to basically trade land with Native Americans, if that makes sense. So the government recognizes the federal government recognizes the fact that there are a lot of whites living in these states who want to push the Native Americans off that land because they want to take it and have cotton plantations and grow cotton and make money that way. So for a lot of whites, no matter how hard the natives in these 5 civilized tribes tried to follow the white man's way of life, no matter how white they tried to become, it wouldn't matter because what they wanted at the end of the day was their land. So this idea was that the natives would leave their land, give it to the whites, and then they would instead be settled on land west of the Mississippi in the Louisiana Purchase, where present-day Oklahoma is. So that would be Indian Territory. In 1832, the Cherokee Nation is going to challenge this forced removal, and the forced removal started in 1831. So in 1832, the Supreme Court is going to state that, I'll explain and then I'll tell you what you can write. Okay, so what the court is going to state is that the Native American tribes living on this land are a separate entity. So the state governments in Florida and Mississippi, but in this particular court case in Georgia, cannot rule over the Native Americans who are living there. And so as a result, the Supreme Court says, Georgia, you cannot force the Cherokee off their land. The Cherokee are allowed to stay. And basically, President Jackson and his supporters say, well, if that's your decision, then you come and enforce it. So, President Jackson encourages Georgia to ignore the verdict. If you want something short to write under the 1832 Supreme Court ruling, you can write Let's see. Supreme Court rules that Cherokee Indians can stay on their land in Georgia. So the Supreme Court rules that the Cherokee Indians can stay on their land in Georgia. Okay, so Jackson encourages Georgia to ignore the verdict. And over a period of several years, like I said, this forced removal actually started in 1831. Then for the Cherokee, there was hope after the Supreme Court ruling, but for much of the 1830s, the U.S. military is going to force these 5 civilized tribes to what they call Indian Territory. And I'll show you, I have a map. Let me just find the slide. Okay, here it is. So here you can see some of this is just for the Cherokee. Like I said, there are 4 other tribes that are also forced westward, and some of these natives are chained. For the most part, they're just marched. Some of them they travel via water, and they're forced off their land into this land that they're not familiar with, west of the Mississippi, so that white Americans can take their land. And this forced removal is referred to as the Trail of Tears. The conditions were terrible. They can't take their belongings with them. They're low on supplies. The army did not bring enough food and water and clothing, blankets for all the people that they are forcefully removing. Okay, so there's a lot of disease. There's a lot of cholera, whooping cough, those types of things. So if you want anything to write under conditions, I would write not enough food or clothing, lots of disease, and starvation. It's just a terrible, terrible march really west, just so that the whites could have their land in these areas where the natives already happen to be living. The mortality rate, thousands of these natives died along the way. Just the Cherokee alone, I think that the estimate is around 5,000 died. But I believe the end statistic is that maybe over 125,000 Native Americans of those 5 civilized tribes are resettled, forcefully resettled. Okay, so what do you want to know here? In general, I think it's helpful to remember that Jacksonian democracy is limited to white men. But as far as what to highlight in this slide, I would highlight the Indian Removal Act. Just know, I mean, all you really need to know is that the government is forcing the natives to move west. And then I would highlight 4, Jackson encouraged Georgia to ignore the verdict. 4, 5, and 6. So you just want to know the government is forcing, under Jackson, is forcing these natives westward, so that white Americans living in the southern states can have their land for cotton plantations. Okay, there are a few other things I want to just briefly say about antebellum society in general, and then we'll talk about our reform movements. While you're still writing, I'll just say, I think you have something similar in your notes for test 2, but I just want to make sure that you have this in your notes for test 3. I'm not sure You actually have this in your notes for exam two. And we're going to talk a lot about the Cotton Kingdom for our remaining class time. So, Cotton Kingdom is basically what people called the states of the Deep South. Why? Because that's where cotton rules the economy. Cotton really just rules the economy. The soil there is very conducive to growing cotton, and so the cotton plantations are the most lucrative in this area. Now, the demand for cotton is coming from northern factories in the U.S. and Britain. This you might have in your notes. I think you do, but for test two. So the demand for cotton is coming from the factories in the northern U.S. and Britain. Okay. Let's talk for a moment about free blacks because we're going to spend a lot of time talking about slavery, the politics of slavery mostly. And I don't want to give you the impression that all blacks in America are enslaved. As you know, the states in the North have begun to, it started in early America to outlaw slavery. And so now we're at this point where we're trying to keep this balance between northern free states and southern slave states. So when you have these free states, the blacks who live in those states are free. That doesn't mean that they are considered equal to whites. There is a lot of discrimination against blacks, free blacks in the North. For example, they are often just told, you can't have this job because you're black or something like that. They're really looked down upon among many whites. I wish I could tell you that all whites in the North were abolitionists, were for freeing slaves and for equality, but unfortunately that's not the case. So they face a lot of discrimination, people looking down on them, but there are a lot of restrictive laws as well. So for example, there are laws against free blacks voting. I'll give you some examples to write. So against voting, against movement. So what I mean is a lot of free blacks are prohibited from moving to a different state. There's a lot of segregation in public places. Free blacks in the North are forced into the lowest paying jobs. They really are not, they don't have as many job opportunities available to them, even though they're free. They're often just, as I said, denied jobs based on their race.